Good afternoon. That was a terrific presentation. I'm Frank Kramer. I'll moderate this panel on military and intelligence actions in cyberspace. Just to remind, as before, session is on the record, and please keep your phones off, or at least silence them, I should say. We have a great panel. Let's see, Emily Goldman, whom I've known for a long time. She's the policy planning staff at the Department of State now. Colonel Hairk from Estonia, who is the commander of their cyber command, the Estonian Defense Force. Chris Inglis is a former deputy director of the NSA, a distinguished visiting professor at the Naval Academy, a managing director of Paladin Capital, member of the Defense Science Board, and multiple other appointments. Major General Renner, Wolfgang Renner, who is the commander of the Nato Communication Information Systems Group, and is the Deputy Chief of Staff of Cyberspace at SHAPE, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers in Europe. And then my good friend, Major General Ed Wilson, now retired, but Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So we're going to go through a series of issues, which you've heard already. I've been here all day. We started off with regional approaches. We then went to diplomacy and norms. You've heard from the FBI, you've heard from DHS. Very good presentation with respect to Cyber Command, with a focus more on what I would call the gray area. As we talk about the military sets of activities, I also want to make sure that our panel covers what normally is called armed attack, because in the worst instance, there's a possibility that we would have to utilize cyber as part of an actual, say, a NATO defensive operation against an adversary, actual armed attack. But also, again, as the General just said before, very significant sets of activities with respect to the hybrid areas. Some of the questions I think you'll want to be thinking about in terms of how do we think about this and how did we get to where we are in persistent engagement is the difference between responding to an incident and responding to a context which is a continuous kind of context. The difference between thinking about one-off kinds of things and countries that have been named as adversaries in cyberspace, and we have 4. Thinking about the difference between disrupting cyber activities and maybe this is just a word set of issues, but deterring in the sense of trying to keep them from happening. And also think about the role of the private sector. What does the private sector actually have to do with military and intelligence operations? And you've heard the General just before talk about Cyber Command's support to the private sector. What about the private sector support in terms of a situation in which there were an armed attack or the like? So, for example, if we had a situation in northeastern Europe, the NATO strategy is reinforcement. To get the forces there, you obviously would have to utilize transportation, you have to utilize communications, you'd have to do a whole lot of things dependent on the private sector. How does that work? What I'm going to do is ask General Wilson to start, and then we'll go to Emily Goldman, then General Renner, Colonel Hairk, and then I'm going to ask Chris Inglis to wrap up. He's got, I think, the broadest set of understanding because he was both substantially in the government for many, many years, but now has been in the private sector in a number of places and can talk to both. So, Ed, do you want to start off?
Sounds great, absolutely. Frank, thanks for the introduction and really the opportunity to be on the panel. What a great event. Listening to some of the speakers prior to it, it kind of culminates in a great setup in terms of this panel. So as Frank highlighted, Ed Wilson worked at the Pentagon on the OSD cyber policy team. I thought what I'd do is kind of walk you through the journey that we've been on as a Department of Defense over the last year or two with regards to the strategic environment that we're operating in, the way that we're thinking about the problem, some of our prioritization, some of the concepts that we've rolled out in the form of a DoD cyber strategy and some of the follow-on activity associated with that. It was a recognition then by Secretary Mattis, this really a little before this time last year, as he was coming into the administration, and we published in the Department of Defense a new national defense strategy. And as part of that was a recognition that the strategic environment that we're operating in, no matter what domain, was really in an environment of revisionist powers that are seeking to compete against the United States and allies and partners across the full spectrum, but especially below thresholds of our traditional responses. We see that in all of the domains of operation, to include cyberspace. So the challenge that the Secretary laid out for us about a little over a year ago, was to look at in the cyberspace arena is to update our constructs and our strategy on how the department would address the threats that we were seeing. And so we went on a journey beginning in the fall of 2017, and it culminated with publication and release of our strategy last late August, early September timeframe. So we mimicked very similar to the National Defense Strategy in terms of revisionist powers. But in our mission space, we see those thresholds and the activity that are really below our traditional thresholds of response being in the areas, and some of them have been cited here just in the last couple of presentations, attempts to either surveil or attack, and we're seeing it on the global stage, critical infrastructure of nations, a theft of intellectual property that then roll on at volume over time, create strategic disadvantage or risk for the nation, our allies and partners, as well as the disinformation or malign influence campaigns that we see globally, to include here in the United States by Russia and others. And so that was the construct or the environment that we began to craft the strategy. To compete and to not cede the strategic advantage that we recognized we were ceding because of those activities below traditional thresholds, we came up with a construct defined as defend forward. And a couple of areas, and what we were seeking to do was to emphasize the unique attributes of the Department of Defense alongside our interagency partners, but also to communicate the unique focus of the Department of Defense on external threats, just like we do in other domains of operation, that we seek to do the same. So in the defend forward construct, we want to be able to see threats on a daily basis. We see them forming, to be able to mitigate those threats. And so I think you've heard the term persistent engagement, persistent contact, persistent innovation. That is the operational art that's required to be able to be successful in this arena. And so from a defend forward construct, we want to be able to see those threats and mitigate those threats at the source, if possible. So as we have grown and matured our cyber forces, they're focused on those external threats. The defend forward construct also helps us to articulate and clarify our roles and responsibilities domestically in the defense of the nation, alongside, as Chris Krebs was just describing, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, and others that are seeking to defend and secure our critical infrastructure here in this nation and with our friends and allies. And so the Department of Defense has a role. We were having a little bit of trouble clarifying what that role is. The defend forward construct helps us do that. We bring the capacity, the unique attributes of the Department of Defense in terms of information sharing, and then incident response if required at scale for significant events, to be able to support DHS and the other critical infrastructure leads for the nation. And so that's, in a nutshell, the construct in terms of the strategy. We have 5 key areas, key priorities for the department. The first is to be able to operate in a contested environment, a cyber contested environment. That's a challenge. That means that we're bringing force structure from the Department of Defense, weapon systems, major installations in terms of critical infrastructure to be able to operate through a cyber contested environment. And as we've matured that construct and looked at the gaps, we continue to really drive to solutions there. The second is to be able to operate and bring cyber effects operations into our traditional joint force as we employ joint forces around the world in all of our domains. And so it's really bringing alongside cyber capabilities and normalizing those, maturing those, so that it's a natural extension of the way that we project power as a Department of Defense. Also, we want to be able to defend and secure our information and our data and our networks around the world. So as we operate both from garrison or forward deployed, is that information, that command control, communications infrastructure that we have is secure, so that we have confidence in that and trust in that, as well as the long range in terms of defending and understanding the threats associated with our defense industrial base. And so the strategic advantage that we gain by data that's associated with our national security. Also, we want to be able to, as I highlighted earlier, be able to help defend critical infrastructure in the homeland. And so that's the fourth. And then the last is, this is not a solo sport, if you will. It takes partnerships around the world with international partners, with our industry partners, as well as across the interagency here in the U.S. And so we've been very, very focused on that. The bottom line is we seek to put in structures of deterrence to be able to counter and push back on those nations or organizations that are breaching the norms of behavior on the international front and bring consequences when those norms of behavior are violated. And so that's what you see in our strategy today. And it's alongside our international partners, it's alongside our interagency partners to be able to achieve that. And so we've, as you heard General Hawk highlight, we've begun to put in place processes for decision making. We've identified the proper investments to be able to execute that strategy, and we're on that journey. So it's been a fairly marked, very proactive strategy that most have seen. And by all measures, I think we're on the right path and look forward to the discussion afterwards in terms of questions. Thank you for the time.
Thanks very much. Emily?
Thank you, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting this event. So I'm an NSA civilian currently on detail to the Office of Policy Planning in the State Department. What I'd like to do, however, is put on my academic hat. I spent 20 years teaching in the university, and I think that might be a perspective that will help bring together some of the threads of the conversation that we've been having. And these ideas also informed one of the documents that General Hawk had suggested was the command cyberspace strategy. U.S. Cyber Command had a vision, command vision. So that's what I'm going to try to do here, and I think as Daz D. Wilson said, really the anchoring construct is great power competition. I mean, I've seen that not only across DoD, but across the Department of State in terms of how we think about operating. Clearly in cyberspace, there are a lot of adversaries, malignant actors, but two of them, I would argue, are engaged in strategic cyber behavior with the overall intent of eroding the current international distribution of power. And for these actors, cyberspace is a seam in great power competition. It's a way for them to gain global influence, to reduce the power of the United States. And what's important about it is it does not have to be through illegal activity. So we look at strategic foreign technology investment, the open source manipulation of political discourse through social media. So I think this is the challenge that we're facing. And in this great power competition, it is occurring in both physical and virtual space. But I would argue that cyberspace has emerged as a key arena in that competition. And as has been said, this is playing out below the threshold of armed conflict. Why is that the case? Because cyberspace allows states, through continuous campaigns of nonviolent operations, to undermine each other's power. It's a vector to weaken military power, economic competitiveness, and political legitimacy without ever setting foot on another soil or resorting to armed attack. And in the history of warfare, this is relatively unprecedented. Historically, one would have to engage in some sort of territorially focused, overt, violent armed attack in order to shift the distribution of power. Not always, but preponderantly. But what we're seeing is that shift in that power is occurring below the threshold of war. So in essence, that competition space has become just as strategically consequential as the space of armed conflict. So to quote from the DoD cyber strategy, it acknowledges that our competitors have been deterred from engaging the U.S. and our allies in armed conflict, and therefore are using cyberspace to steal technology, disrupt government and commerce, challenge our democracy, and threaten our critical infrastructure. And this includes persistent campaigns in and through cyberspace that pose a long-term strategic risk to our nation, our allies, and our partners. So I would argue if you look at this, what we see is that there are two strategic spaces. One is the space of armed conflict, militarized crises, and war, and the other, I would argue, is the strategic space of competition. And there's also, in theory, two different strategic concepts that operates in those spaces, and they're complementary, as Ambassador Strayer mentioned this morning. Deterrence, and the other one I'm going to call, with my academic hat, I'm going to call persistence, okay? Persistent engagement. I know there's a lot of, I don't want to confuse throwing more terms around, but I think it helps to think in terms of these concepts. And the DoD cyber strategy acknowledges that on the one hand, we have to deter malicious cyber activities, and that the U.S. will use all tools of national power to deter adversaries from conducting cyber activity, particularly that which constitutes a use of force. Okay, so that's in a sense a threshold. That is where deterrence applies. And the question was raised is, how does deterrence apply below that threshold? And I think that this notion of persistent engagement or persistence is really a concept that makes sense in the activity that's occurring below the threshold in cyberspace in day-to-day competition. And so, as has been mentioned, the department, according to the strategy, will counter these campaigns by defending forward to intercept and halt threats, and by strengthening the cybersecurity of systems and networks, that's resilience, and also by partnering with our private sector and our foreign allies to contest cyber activity that could threaten us. So there are basically three kind of operational concepts embedded in there: resilience, defend forward, and contesting. So in my opinion, I would assert that conflict can be deterred, but competition cannot. Competition must be managed, and it must be shaped. And that's what we've learned over the past several years. Some of those specifics are that cyberspace is a dynamic domain of constant contact and continuous interaction. Malicious actors are persistently active. They operate below the internationally accepted thresholds in order to minimize risk to themselves while gaining the benefits of their behavior. And I would argue in the past that we have ceded initiative in that space. That does not mean that we have done nothing, because clearly we have. It's tended to be reactive and intermittent in response. And what we see is that we need to be continuously engaged. I would also argue that the challenge is indeed a strategic one, not just technical or tactical. What I mean by that is that at any single action, any hack, any incident, any intrusion alone might not be strategically consequential, but cumulatively, those effects can be devastating. Think of intellectual property theft at scale, loss of military R&D, interference in our democratic processes. So I think it's useful to talk more in terms of strategic campaigns instead of incidents or hacks and attacks in many cases. And that recognizing our collective engagement to address these campaigns has to be persistent in the way that the campaigns are. I think that we're at the point where persistent engagement really is best understood, or should be understood, as a whole of nation plus approach. Okay, so I think in many cases these ideas kind of surfaced within the military and intelligence community because the behavior that we were seeing was so visible to those communities. But in reality, it really does involve partnerships across the interagency, with the private sector, with an informed citizenry, with our allies and partners, and therefore, and their citizenry and their industries as well. So I think it helps us all to think about what that looks like. Let me wrap up by coming back to reflecting on panel 2 this morning, which was called Enforcing Norms, Diplomacy and Law Enforcement. I would like to suggest if we were to amend the title of this panel, it could be Constructing Norms. And the reason, because in the title of this panel, it talks about through actions, through military and intelligence, but it can also be whole of nation actions. And this goes back to a point that Mr. Coe raised this morning in his keynote. There's probably much agreement in this room on the norms we want to get to. The question is, how do we get to them? So I'm going to leave you with my pitch on norms. I think norms do exist today. I would argue that they just may not be the ones that we collectively in this room like. And I define norms as normal practice, what is in fact occurring, the behaviors that we are seeing. And that it's important to engage in conversations about what we would like those norms to become, but we have to also recognize that there already are de facto norms that exist, because there's not a convergence of expectations across the international community about what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. So as much as we talk about enforcing norms, we need to talk about constructing norms. 4 basic ways, there's probably more, but to construct norms. One is the one that really informs the US approach, and that really is that preponderant powers can declare and institute norms. If they have enough power to essentially provide the benefits and to deny those benefits to those who don't agree with those norms, they can do what the United States did in conjunction with its allies, is to set up the Bretton Woods system after World War II. And those who didn't want to play were not part of the system. But I would argue we don't have any country that has that preponderance of power today. Not since the late 1990s. In fact, the world we're in now is one of intense norm competition. Other ways to get convergence on norms are a reaction to a mass event, which I don't think anybody here wants to wait for. Global norms against genocide resulted from the Holocaust. We certainly don't want to be in a position for waiting for something. A third approach is to model good behavior and to name and shame transgressors. I think that's important, but it has to be consistent. It cannot be sporadic, because then it just stimulates more bad behavior. The fourth way, and this really comes from much of the research on norms in the international security community, is that norms converge from behavior, and then they are mature through international discourse. So what that means is that through persistent engagement, through engaging, through acting, through demonstrating what we think is acceptable and not acceptable on a continuous basis every day collectively, through that over time we will come to a convergence of expectations about what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. So I would argue that we are on the same path to those norms. We just have to ask ourselves the best way to get there. And I'll stop.
Thank you. That's, I think, very, very useful, because that ties in a couple of the panels we've heard, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. General Renner?
So, Frank, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the Atlantic Council for arranging this conference and for inviting me to speak. And of course, it's an honor to share the stage with such an auspicious group of experts. Other than the US DoD is representing NATO, I have really to admit, is a relative newcomer in cyberspace. It was only 3 years ago that NATO recognized cyberspace as an operational domain, and less than 1 year that the heads of state gave SHAPE the green light to establish the Cyberspace Operations Center, or CIOC, as we call it. One of our basic premises was we seek to operationalize cyberspace is not to recreate the wheel. In other words, we don't want to figure out how to solely and independently operate in cyberspace. We want to integrate cyberspace into how we operate. We want to make cyberspace elements fit into all the operational machinery that already exists in allied operations and missions. NATO isn't new to operations. We have been performing military operations over 70 years. What's new is the introduction of a fourth domain, cyberspace, to the already existing physical domains. This is what the heads of state told us to do. Defend cyberspace as effectively as you do air, land, and sea. I don't meant to suggest this is easy. However, because cyberspace poses some unique traits from the other domains, and because commanding and controlling assets in an alliance is more difficult when those assets are sovereign capabilities owned by the individual nations that make up the NATO force structure. I've enjoyed many opportunities to discuss these challenges since I have been in my current post, and nearly everyone wants to talk about integrating effects. What they mean by that is offensive cyber. This aspect is, from my point of view, less complicated than defensive cyber. NATO has made clear that it will not develop offensive cyberspace capabilities. However, it will integrate sovereign cyberspace effects from the nations that have the means and willingness to provide them. The CIOC will be the entity which integrates those effects. It will do so by ensuring that cyberspace aspects are part of all our military operation plans at the strategic, operational, and tactical level. The CIOC will also be present at the Joint Effects Board. We're talking about strategic effects, operationally driven, and will present cyberspace capabilities provided by the nations as options alongside other kinetic or non-kinetic effects to the appropriate commander for consideration to achieve his desired or certain objective. This is what I meant by not recreating the wheel. We are not changing our process, we are introducing new capabilities to meet the new challenges of operating in a cyber-contested environment. This is important from a deterrence perspective. Our adversaries need to know we are prepared to defend the alliance in all domains, to include cyberspace. Defensive in cyberspace is equally important, perhaps more so. We need to have situational awareness of the cyberspace aspects of our joint operating areas and our cyberspace areas of interest, which is truly all of cyberspace itself. That will require cooperation from all NATO nations, not just as it applies to their contribution to the NATO force structure, but also other areas which could impact our ability to operate, such as, for example, critical national infrastructure in the areas we operate in. Sharing of information will be very important, and we are about establishing those relationships with the CIOC's counterparts in the nations. Finally, we need to ensure our forces are prepared to fight in cyberspace contested environment, because all engagements will have cyberspace aspects. We do this through training in various schoolhouses, academies, and, of course, validated exercises. NATO wants to be recognized as a place where our nation can send its airmen, soldiers, marines, and sailors who know something about information security or something about operations, and get back cyberspace warriors when we send them back to their home countries. We have some work to do in this regard, but we are engaged in developing our capabilities. We are confident our vision is becoming reality. Finally, let's not forget what this is all about. We don't look at cyberspace for the sake of knowing more about cyberspace. We achieve situational awareness of cyberspace, plan to maneuver successfully within it, and ensure its status supports mission assurance. Our success in cyberspace ensures successful operations in the other domains. Just as importantly, cyberspace is a place in which we can achieve effects independent of other domains. And it is a place which can be supported by forces in the other domains. Again, all in the name of mission assurance and as contribution to deterrence messaging. I look forward for the discussion and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel. Yes, thank you, Mr. Kramer and AtlanticCouncil. I'm very honored to be here and share the experiences, so-called frontline country, Estonia. I'm Colonel Anders Hairk, and I'm the commander, Estonian Cyber Command, newly established unit, approximately one year old. Yes, since 2007, we have witnessed cyber attacks in Estonia and its neighborhood, which have targeted the mind and the hearts of the people, as well as the information and processes that supports everyday life. And with the following, I will give an overview what are the main conclusions from recent conflicts in Estonia, Georgia, and Ukraine, and how those lessons identify change Estonian way to conduct cyber security. First, Estonia. Yes, 2007, everyone, I guess, knows it. We, as a First Nation, suffered from state-level coordinated cyber attack. It was mostly denial of service attack against banks and governmental website, linked to a wider political campaign against removing a overtime statue. The aim of those attacks were to erode people's trust in a governmental institution and to intensify feeling of insecurity. So we call them more or less info operation through the cyberspace. Since then, we have seen several cyber attacks in the post-Soviet geopolitical space. Georgia in 2008, similar attacks, but now in parallel with the kinetic military actions. We can say those activities through cyberspace were supporting mainly information warfare operation rather than causing physical damage. Extensive use of proxies made technical attribution back to the attacker and or to the state much more harder. And we saw that military operation and cyber operation were carried out in synchronized way. Ukraine. While the first phase of the conflict, cyber operation was similar to Estonian and Georgian campaign, attacking digital infosphere and critical service providers, with the same aim, to erode people's trust and to cultivate insecurity. So-called second phase, cyber attack were also carried out in parallel with the kinetic operations on the ground, Crimea and the East Ukraine. And also we witnessed kinetic operation in support of cyber operation through gaining physical control over the Ukrainian telecom provider in Crimea, March 2014. And the aim is to reroute the internet traffic to collect information and use it for a later exploit. So, in generic observation from those conflicts, two of them. First one of the distinctive goals by the adversary is using cyber means and ways against a soft element of a national power, so-called critical services and infrastructure, in order to manipulate public and international opinion and to undermine the government. So they're going for the heart and mind of a nation. Second observation is that cyber can be used to support military operation, whatever it's suppressing the communication, gathering intelligence, or targeting troops. Also, military operation, our own military operation, are often dependent of civilian and commercial ICT infrastructure. So what do we do? What we did to mitigate those risks? Again, two major areas. First, 2007 showed us, and conflict in Georgia and Ukraine proved that in order to protect Estonian against future cyber attacks, we need to take the whole state approach to do that. We needed to define the roles and responsibilities inside the government and also within the private sector. Fortunately, luckily for us, the private sector understood that government alone cannot protect the entire domain, and they were open to dialogue and they were really supportive. Today is that state ensures responsibility to coordinate the planning and actions between different ministries to ensure the protection of Estonian cyber domain. And secondly, while Estonian Defence Force's primary task is to protect Estonia with the military means and capabilities, we have established Estonian Cyber Command. in order to support our military leaders with adequate and timely information, as well to support military operations in and through cyberspace. Today we see the info operation as part of cyber operations, and there are ongoing discussion to add also the electronic warfare mission to the cybercom portfolio, so when all the elements are composed. While we made a lot of progress in this area, protecting our cyberspace, we also understand that we need to observe and adapt constantly to counter any possible future threats.
Thank you very much. Chris?
Great, thanks. So again, a huge thank you to the Atlantic Council for constituting this group, not just this panel, but the assembled intellectual power in this room. There's not much that we couldn't take on, if not solve. The remarks that have been made so far have pretty much covered the waterfront. I find myself agreeing in turn with each of them. I have little to add. I'll try to summarize my own thoughts, but hopefully quickly so that we can get to some of your questions. The first point that I would make is that the changes that have been described in U.S. Defense Department strategy, policy, and law, authorizing law of 2018, well described, and may to the casual observer look like we're trying to stir things up a bit, that we're trying to be provocative, that we're trying to stimulate, perhaps even kind of go on the offense. I think that the truth of the matter is it's just the opposite. That in fact what they are is a reflection not of any particular event at this moment in time, whether it's great power competition or the events that we've suffered over the last 10 years. Rather, it's a final and I think useful reconciliation of the fact that cyber is an enduring and essential component of the fabric of our society. And we need to therefore treat cyber as an instrument of power, not the instrument of power, but an instrument of power. We need to rationalize it. I think, in fact, if you look back over the last 10 years, perhaps even further, 2007, but in particular in the American experience, attacks on our financial infrastructure in 2012, an attack on Sony Pictures, kind of arguably a component of our private sector in 2014, the kind of attacks in 2017, all by nation states, WannaCry, NotPetya, impactful, brazen, indiscriminate, didn't need to be the target to be the victim. All of those constitute a failure to properly defend that realm, properly to collaborate and use all the instruments at our disposal, and therefore an escalatory result that derives from inaction, not overaction. And so the Congress in 2018, I think, put their finger on it when they said in the McCain Act, the National Defense Authorization Act, we need to treat cyber as a traditional instrument of military power. Now that is down the military lane and perhaps maybe too narrowly framed. We just need to treat cyber as an ordinary instrument of power, hopefully with extraordinary thresholds when we apply it to achieve some consequence on other parties. And so going forward, my own sense of this is that we're attempting to rationalize cyber. We're attempting to use all instruments of power, individual power, private sector power, national power, coalition power. We're trying to use all of those, and to do so where we can essentially apply all the instruments at our disposal in a concurrent way, so that the left and the right hand are in fact joined in a common activity. We have been for too long defending in silos. We have for too long tried to substitute division of effort. Everybody defends alone, or at worst, we've trying to substitute deconfliction as a meaningful substitute for true collaboration. We're being crowdsourced by adversaries, whether they're nation states or criminals. We need to crowdsource back. And I think that's what these changes are all about, whether it's having forward presence to discern at the earliest possible moment what hazards, what risks are being preyed upon you, whether it's defend forward, which really is a defensive activity predicated upon the offensive action of an adversary, or whether it's simply the rich and collaborative sharing that have been described by Chris Krebs and others here today. I think that's what we're trying to do, is to rationalize this going forward, not spin it up, not stimulate it.
That's great. Let me ask a panel a question. Would you say, and I think we can all agree that we, which I would say is the West, the United States, the West, NATO, countries like Estonia, have made significant progress over the last several years. But do we need more resources to be put into the cyber arena? Do we need more people? Do we need advances in the technologies like AI, or what, the apparent oncoming rush of 5G? Are we at a, adequately good place, and we have, if we just keep on doing what we're doing, we'll be all right? So, for example, there was a GAO report that talked about some vulnerabilities in weapon systems. They didn't specifically describe them. There are issues as to, for example, even Chris Krebs talking about what does he do? He's an advisor. He's not an operator. So, do we need more sets of resources in order to deal with the problem that we're facing? And
I'll start. No and yes. First, I don't think we're making best use of the resources already at our disposal, and we ought to then stop, pause, and try to figure out how to make best use of what we already have in hand. And if cyber is a realm, a domain that is comprised of at least 3 constituent pieces, there is technology, that's the visible part. There are people, right? Skills, intellectual power, kind of audacity comes from the human component, maneuverability, agility, and then finally roles and responsibilities, doctrine, procedure about how do you assign out all of that. That's not squared away, and therefore we need to kind of consider, have we made best use of the technology that routinizes, automates, perhaps using analytics, bordering on heuristics, or even artificial intelligence, to equip ourselves with a full and certain knowledge of what's really happening in this domain, so that we might then turn to the humans and say, defend that, right? Have we made full use of all the human power in the room? We talk a lot about a shortage of cyber jobs, 500,000, I think, in the United States within 2 years. But in my view, there are 315 million Americans who must know something more about cyber in order to properly defend themselves, or at least take up their role in cyberspace, and probably 70 million. That's a figure from the Aspen Institute, 70 million professionals who arguably are engineers first, or lawyers first, or kind of human resource professionals first, but they need to know something more about cyber in order to fulfill their proper roles, line abreast in this domain. So make better use of the human beings. And then finally, roles, responsibilities. We don't yet have a concurrency such that we're all comfortable standing line abreast in this space, knowing who's going to do what on the right or the left, without first seeking a referendum or some formal delegation in a hierarchical way from top to bottom. We need to be more comfortable essentially applying all these instruments of power line abreast. When we get that squared away, yes, there is, I think, a need for more technology, more kind of advancements in terms of the routinization, automation. There is a need for more people, and certainly there's a need for perhaps greater and crisper authority. But I wouldn't start there, because I think we'd just be throwing more fodder onto a fire that's already raging, perhaps in a way that's not yet fully controlled.
And I would just add to Chris's comments, I think we've been on a journey to try to normalize or rationalize cyber alongside all of the other domains. The operations and the activities associated with what we see in cyberspace today are relatively new. And as Chris highlighted, I think we've been in a world where we've deconflicted and we've had silos of activity. The journey we've been on with the strategies to bring the full weight of the nation and our allies and partners and industry together to get more weight of effort associated when we work together. And so it's integrating those activities, which is really the goal. And so as a steward of one of the many stewards, especially in the Department of Defense, we're always seeking to optimize the resource, because if we're going to put more in cyber, that means someone else is probably going to go without. And so until we do due diligence to get technology right, and as Chris highlighted, people, but also I think the weakness that we had was in our processes and our policies, in the way that we were expending resources alongside each other, is to get more out of the full weight that we've already are expending. I think until we do a good job of cleaning that up, to raise our hand and say that we need to pour a lot of additional resources in, I think would be a bit premature. That said, we have identified specific gaps. I know in the Department of Defense, we all have looked at that and very discreetly been able to make some, I think, sage choices to increase some investment. But, it could be a bottomless pit if we continue to just write checks after check after check. And so I think there's a measure and a balance there.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely ready to support this yes-no approach because this morning, you might remember, we learned manpower is a scarce resource. This is one of the biggest problems to get the experts. So from my point of view, one of the first steps is to focus on training, get the people educated, get them in the right place, and do exercises. From a military perspective, exercises is always an important step. And the second area we have to improve by, we put in really additional resources. The question is availability. This is talking about mechanisms, talking about roles and responsibilities, delegating of authorities. From a warfighting perspective, you should be able to respond. What I'm talking about is speed of relevance. And therefore, this is what we have to invest in the first step prior we put in additional bucks or manpower. So, quick answer. Back to you.
Yes, from small country perspective, of course, there is never resources enough. And what you're going to do when you don't have resources, when you have to innovate or do something differently. And the way how we'll deal with this issue is cooperation. We put the back-to-back with like-minded countries or friends, and then you will share your problem, and hopefully you will get their answer. Information sharing, also one of a really important factor here. Don't develop a bicycle yourself, you ask your good friends, and then probably they do have an answer. And even maybe more important is cooperation with a commercial side of a country. And don't set the rules to them, don't tell them what they have to do, but involve them as equal partners, and you can be surprised how helpful and what kind of knowledge and advice might come from them.
Just to add, I think one other challenge, at least within a large government like the United States, is the lack of enough of a shared awareness of what different parts of the government are doing. So I think there are a lot of synergies that we could make, having worked in different agencies. You find out pockets of activity where there's overlap, where there aren't synergies that are really being leveraged. And so I think we need to do better at creating unity of effort with what we have.
So
could I add something to that? So we've talked a lot about collaboration, and earlier there was a question, a really good question to I think Chris Krebs about, what then about sharing perhaps sensitive information? Can we be quicker on the draw for that? I think we have a flawed model for collaboration. Too often what we do is we say, I've now determined that I have something I should share with you. I came to that conclusion alone. You didn't help me figure out whether I should share this with you because I didn't share this up to this point in time with you. And now I have this unholy problem of how do I sanitize that? Maybe I'm a private sector company and I have to make it not proprietary. I have to perhaps, if I'm in the government, declassify it. We've actually started the collaboration from the wrong end. What we ought to do is to actually engage in this shared activity of trying to discover these facts, shards, hunches, do that mitigation and discovery side by side, such that having discovered it together, we might then kind of reserve the right to enrich it off that floor plate. But what we've already done is to collaborate at the lowest possible level. And as we then inform each other about how we might enrich that and it goes up the stack, we come to a collective choice decision about how important this is. We might cross a threshold together that neither one of us could have crossed alone. And so we need to just turn that on its head to say, if we're not engaged in an operational activity to defend this realm side by side, cheek by jowl, we'll never within our silos be able to have enough time and energy to kind of figure out what it is you need to know without you having been a party to the discovery of that in the first place.
From a organizational point of view and a process point of view, as we've talked here, we focused, of course, on cyber, but from the major adversaries, they do more of a gray area hybrid thing. So they have economic sets of activities. For example, Russians utilize chemical weapons, which is low-level use of force. Obviously, the kidnapping of the border guard in Estonia some years ago would be another example of low-level use of force. There are issues of economic subversion and the like. So the question that I would ask you, and maybe General Renner, you could start with this, is the focus on cyber too narrow? Do we need to think a little more broadly? NATO certainly works a lot with the European Union. Are there ways to expand our focus so that we're really dealing with the adversary as a whole, to do what Emily Goldman suggested, strategic campaigns? Is there a way to make sure that we're appropriately responding to the adversary and then creating norms throughout the gray area rather than just a single focus on cyber?
Indeed, I will give it a try. Though a couple of points I would like to raise. It's definitely not complete. However, the first point would be, this is true for NATO and of course for every democracy as well, go rules-based. And these gray areas are definitely difficult. From a NATO perspective, everything has to be on a legal basis which is agreed upon by nations. The second is an easy one. The cooperation with the EU is already ongoing. Secretary General of NATO has already addressed this is a process which is good, but definitely not mature. And the main point I would like to re-mention in this context, maybe other or different from the other domains, cyberspace is much more comprehensive. It's much broader in the interrelationships. Let me give just a simple example. If you talk about transportation and the reliance of military operations being based on that or being relying on that, this is often done by industry, civil sector agencies. If there's an impact on the civil infrastructure, on this industry company, this has immediately an impact on operations. And therefore, this is just a humble example, but this is what I'm talking about, the comprehensiveness of cyberspace. Much more difficult if you're just talking classical air domain or something like that. So these are the three points I would like to raise.
Emily, would you like to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too keen on these terms. I know hybrid warfare has a very specific meaning in the NATO context, recognizing that, gray zone, hybrid, you can't find consensus on how to define them anywhere, except for the fact that it occurs below the threshold of armed conflict. So I think we're back in that same challenge, and I think it occurs in physical space and in virtual space. And at least one of the differences between us and some of our adversaries is that we still have this binary construct, peace or war, and peace is somehow the natural state and war is an aberration. Our adversaries view it as a continuous struggle. And so I think that there's a range of challenges that we face, and that's, that conceptual one I think is foundational to it.
Ed, I'm sorry, Chris.
No, I was just going to add to that human interaction, and that's also true of kind of aggregate human interaction, nation state to nation state, lives across a continuum of collaboration, competition, and conflict, and they exist, kind of all of those states exist at once, depending upon the issue, depending upon the event. And so if that's the continuum, we need to think about cyberspace's role in that, and I think cyberspace classically can have either an instance as a noun. If cyberspace is a noun, if it's a place, if it's something that could be affected, we can affect it with all instruments of power, and we need to think of it as such. We shouldn't think of cyberspace only being impacted by cyber, the verb, by cyber power. If you think of cyber as the verb, it can make a difference to all of the domains of interest that we care about across collaboration, competition, and conflict. And so when I think of hybrid warfare, I don't think so much of the level of intensity, but rather the degree of integration between all of these instruments that we bring to bear to achieve either collaboration or competition or conflict. Typically, it's kind of defined in those latter two phases, but all of these instruments can be used to impact any domain of interest. Cyber is just one of them. It's not the one of them, it's just one of them.
And I would just add, I think when we think about hybrid or gray zone activity, the decision calculus about how we counter that is obfuscated because of the techniques that are being used, thresholds that are being avoided, if you will, attribution that's hard to pin on particular actors. And so as we make decisions in conflict or some run-up into a conflict, it delays our decision calculus. Within the cyberspace, in a man-made domain, it's easier to obfuscate the behavior. And so our traditional way of making decisions that would bring strength to that problem to be able to counter in any type of a low-end conflict to an upper-end conflict is hampered. And so our traditional ways of uniting and bringing together combined power to counter some action is avoided. It delays that response, and so an objective is then achieved without the traditional responses that we have. But I would just also emphasize that while that does present some challenges, cyber, the noun, verb, adjective, in Chris's words, is one of the instruments of power. So I think that the art form here is how do you combine the activities that we want to counter and that we want to execute in the gray zone conflict alongside all of the other instruments of power that we bring to bear as a nation, as a coalition, in particular as a coalition, but we need to be able to make decisions at the pace to counter the threats that we're seeing.
Colonel, Estonia is a small country, works whole of government, so how does that work for you?
Yeah, is a focus of cyber is too narrow. Cyber is not kind of a silver bullet, or it cannot solve all the problems what you have, especially in a military operation. And we would like to have kind of more joint perspective that as much as you need your army, your air, your maritime forces, you need the cyber. And integration and joint command control is really essential on that perspective. Because some cyber issues you can solve, simply in a kinetical world, using just your military forces, or the other way around.
So can I open it up for questions? Anyone has a question, come to the mics, and we'll be happy to get the panel to give all the answers. No questions? Oh, there we are. Yes, sir.
Peter Scharfman, MITRE Corporation. This is really addressed to Emily Goldman, although obviously others may wish to chime in. This morning we heard from several speakers, but notably from Australian official, that there's value in trying to hold other nations to what they have agreed should be a norm, even though their behavior suggests that they'd rather not comply with that norm. And the world's full of situations in which you agree not to do what you really want to do if in exchange someone else will agree not to do what they really want to do, and the two of you can get along better together as a result. So aren't you losing a dimension of integrated activity in the cyber realm by reducing norms to simply whatever behavior exists?
No, so that's a great question. It comes down to whether, I think it's important to have aspirational goals and objectives, and I think certainly it makes sense to codify those among like-minded states. But I would argue if you look at the history of norms in other areas, for example, the law of the sea, which was brought up this morning, it's an iteration between explicit bargaining and tacit bargaining. It's interacting and doing, and it means that we need to continuously push back and demonstrate through action if there is behavior that we don't want. We can't just articulate it. So yes, I think it's important to hold others accountable. I just think that we maybe overestimate at least, how robust those norms are globally. Okay, I mean, I think that it was raised in one of the questions this morning about more the sort of the authoritarian versus democratic perspective on behavior. And I think this is still a very contested space. And it's important to have those conversations with like-minded states, but also to recognize that in order to bring along those who do not buy into that, right, and their behavior is going to be crucial for security and stability globally, that we have to recognize that there has to be this parallel effort to engage them through action and much of that is tacitly through behavior, and it's much of what we do in the other domains as well.
I think that norms and deterrence, right, affecting behavior in the world actually are mutually reinforcing, right? You can't do one without the other. If you only say I'm going to unilaterally deter or modify the behavior of someone in the world, but you don't take the time and effort to describe, what that behavior is, you don't describe those norms, then you better be awake 24 hours a day executing that plan, because you're not going to have any assistance from anybody else, because it's all you all the time. Norms are quite helpful, especially if you enter into a collaborative relationship where all sides can say, I think I understand what the thresholds are here. I therefore have some discriminants that I can apply to see, observe, and perhaps describe that behavior. And then whoever it is that owns the instruments of power can bring that to bear to achieve the desired effect. I think you've got to do both.
Dave Weitzel, also from MITRE. The keynote speaker from Singapore talked about the battling elephants, and maybe you all are describing how well the elephants can battle or not in this panel. But what advice do you have, if we're talking about norms, for all of the ants around the world that might be trampled during the type of conflicts that you're talking about, above the line or below the line? Thank you.
So, Ed, why don't you start off, since you're representing the Department of Defense, the largest elephant?
The largest elephant, okay. So first, I guess, in the norms discussion, I would point that we do have an accepted UN GGE sanctioned set of norms, and so that in the General Assembly has been adopted, and so those norms have been signed up to among all of the nations that are part of the United Nations. And so we do have a baseline to work from that's been accepted. That's under review, continual basis, but that's an international norms of peacetime behavior that is really the baseline we work from. I didn't hear the talk, so my apologies from the Singaporean speaker. I assume it was David Koh who spoke from Singapore. David? Okay, excellent.
I didn't hear it either, but I suspect you're talking about state-on-state activity and how to then the ants who are not states kind of stay clear of the fire. Is that fair?
Is that the thesis? I understand. So from a DoD perspective, any action that we take, we review. And we look with a measure to try to minimize any type of risk or collateral damage, just like we would in terms of normalizing decision-making in any other domain of operations. In the cyberspace domain, it's like-minded in terms of the way that we approach an objective, the options that are put in play, proportionality. During peacetime, we're not seeking to escalate, we're not trying to be aggressive in behavior. We are trying to defend those that breach norms to be able to put some form of consequence. We don't want to escalate in any measure by any stretch of the imagination. And so as we look at options, those deliberations go on day to day. And so the constructs that we've put in place is very deliberate in terms of the decision process, with senior leadership that is involved in those decisions and to help us make the right choices.
So yeah, if I may add on that, my best military advice: do protection and prevention first. In the very first step, prior to get into any norms discussion. And if I got a speaker this morning, right, he was talking about maybe this could be something be put in place or in front of the United Nations. Of course, this would be the largest part. If you have separate nations, for example, Nato, we are talking about 29, or the EU talking about 28. This would be the large number. But the challenge, and this is always national business, therefore, please understand that I will not come up with a NATO position, because NATO has no position on that. The main challenge is the enforcement of norms. And this is basically falls back to nations. I leave it at that.
And I would maybe just add that a response to a norm that's being breached in cyberspace may not be a cyber action. Mm-hmm. It's one of the instruments of power alongside a whole menu of options on the national level, to include attribution, indictments, sanctions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so to think that there has to be a cyber tit for tat, I think is a limited way of thinking about the way strategically we're all looking at the problem.
If I could add, but ants and small mammals, they have choices before them that they can make as to whether they take certain risks or whether they exercise local due diligence. And there has to be an expectation that they do that in order to practice deterrence by denial or perhaps deterrence by avoidance. At the end of the day, they also, I think, fairly have an expectation that the governments will act responsibly, that the elephants will act responsibly, and that when an application of an instrument of government power, whether that's financial sanctions, criminal prosecution, public shaming, diplomacy, maybe even cyber power, that when that can and should be applied, that it will be, using the principles of necessity and proportionality. That hasn't been the record over the last 10 years. It's been, I think, increasingly the propensity of governments to do that over the last 2 years. But we need to stand in when that's necessary to defend the ants, expecting that the ants have played a meaningful role in their own defense.
And I just want to add that if you think back to the model of the fact that much of this behavior is, any particular incident is not necessarily strategically consequential. Okay, so I think it's really important, and I think it's quite telling that none of this has really, to this point, breached the level of armed conflict. And so I think that, the question is, how do you deal with that low-level behavior that has strategic consequences over time? And I think General Hawk was very clear that, majority of this is being more assertive in our defense. That doesn't mean aggressive or offensive. That means actually defending outside of, for example, military networks. And it's not really a deterrence strategy because it's not threatening to punish afterwards. But over time, if you push back, hopefully you'll get a deterrence effect. At some point, you'll come to a sense that this is not worth the energy that we're putting in to try to do X, Y, or Z. And so I think there's a recognition, I think in this space, there is going to be constant contact, there's going to be continuous engagement. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, what are the acceptable and unacceptable things below that threshold of armed conflict? And can we come to an agreement? I think there's some things that we have, other areas we probably need to be more explicit about.
Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. Clayton Barlow Wilcox with Booz Allen Hamilton. Apologize about the voice, just recovering from a little cold here. I had a little bit of a separate topic question related to investment and innovation in regards to military intelligence technologies, and related to what Colonel Trent was talking about on the AI panel earlier in terms of creating a startup within the DoD, which I thought was an interesting concept. Do you feel like the military and intelligence communities are reaping the benefits of a lot of the innovations that are coming out of the startup world? And should the government be more involved in funding that innovation in a more strategic and formulaic way? And I speak really relevantly to around here, there's a huge level of success coming from former NSA folks going out into the startup community, as well as if you look at the Israeli intelligence community is highly successful as well. Where do you see the global government community who's trying to move things forward? Where should they play?
With your background,
So I'm no longer.
Yes.
So my sense is that there is still a need for the government to perhaps take on some of the most audacious forms of research. Quantum computing, who knows whether that's 70 or 50 years away, and there probably is a lot of kind of activity at the edge. But the government ought to be making whatever investments it can in those things that have a low probability but a high payoff to essentially advance that. The intellectual innovation, that's now richly spread across both the private and public sectors, mostly the private sector, and there ought to be some degree of collaboration in order to push that forward. And the government ought to be facilitating, inspiring, perhaps by example, making use of that inside of its own kind of own mission areas. But the government does have a role. It's perhaps less dramatic than it was in the 1960s and the kind of days of the space program, but it's still important, and it's still in those corners that nobody's going to shine a light into, and therefore the government ought to be doing some of that.
Chris?
Hey, very good panel. I'll ask a question I've asked in my panel this morning, which were diplomats and law enforcement folks. So at least it's not in doctrine, it's not been announced publicly this way, but at least some at DOD have said that the persistent engagement strategy is a recognition that deterrence doesn't work in cyberspace. First, I would submit we haven't actually tried deterrence in cyberspace. We haven't imposed the cost we want to impose, but I'd ask that of the panel, how do these exist together? Are we in fact imposing at least cyber costs in favor of the persistent engagement strategy? And then the second question is more key to the people who are not in the government, because I think they'd be more free in talking about this. Chris, in the Defense Science Board report you wrote on deterrence, you helped write on deterrence, you talked about tailored engagement strategies and hitting the adversary where it hurt, essentially. What is it that we can and should be doing with respect to Russia, particularly, to have that effect? I'd say so far, we haven't really done that. What is it we can do that actually would do it?
So, Emily, do you want to take on the first
Yeah,
question?
I'll chime in on the first part. I think that's a false dichotomy to say that just because you're looking at another approach to dealing with malicious behavior below the threshold means that somehow says deterrence is not appropriate in certain places. I would argue that for significant cyber incidents, something that's an armed attack equivalent, I think in fact we actually I'm just saying in fact we have.
I'm saying below. I get above the threshold of armed attack. Below.
Below the threshold of armed attack, I think that previous administrations have stated that we will use all means possible to demonstrate and to respond. And what we saw was that there weren't the responses that in any way were shaping that adversary's behavior. I would argue that through I think you need to separate deterrence as a strategy from deterrence as an effect. And we want deterrence as an effect. The question is, how do we get that? And is it only through a deterrent strategy, which is prospective response? And the logic of persistent engagement is that we can't, each individual action may not be significant, and so we don't respond, and then cumulatively over time, the costs are strategically consequential. So it's looking at the strategic environment, it's looking at the strategic space in the same way as, with the advent of nuclear weapons, there was an effort to say, if you cannot defend, therefore, we need to deter. And it's looking at cyberspace as a strategic space and saying, how does that environment operate and what is the appropriate strategy? So that's the way I think, that's the way that I would look at it. And, in both cases, time will tell and we'll see over time. And it's not, no one strategy is going to, not have setbacks here and there. But I think that there was a consensus that what we were doing, whether you define it as whether it was a deterrent strategy or not, wasn't working. And so there was a quest to look for something else.
So, Chris, I know I want you to do the answer.
Just add to that. If deterrence, at the end of the day, is effected or felt in the mind's eye, the kind of the brain of the person you're trying to influence, then I think that the activities authorized and possibly undertaken in 2018, as described here today, forward presence, forward defense, are in fact a reflection that we haven't been using all the tools available to us, but it supports deterrence. It doesn't kind of say we're giving up on deterrence. And despite the fact that some of these actions look like they're tactical and they might be cost imposition and therefore there's a flash and a bang and we're kind of done with that, hopefully, and I think probably, they're all applied with some forward view that we mean to change the behavior of these characters, these organizations, in a way that makes them more consistent with widely accepted, hopefully coalition accepted norms. So I think that can all be stitched together to say that these could in fact be quite strategic and quite focused on deterrence and focused on trying to bring us back to norms. That the government's inaction over the last 5-6 years at not perhaps addressing some of these transgressions was that was escalatory and led to an absence of deterrence.
But I think, what I'm saying is you can have both in you can do the persistent engagement, but also actually impose cost.
I agree. I think it is norms and deterrence, and I think that persistent engagement must be described in the context of each of those things as a contributor, as opposed to something that perhaps blows it up.
And then the other question was, what should we do against Russia?
If it's felt in the mind's eye of the beholder, right, the recipient, it's measured on receipt, then we have to figure out what does Vladimir Putin kind of care about and hold that at risk. It might be, some of the confidence that his nation has that, he's essentially operating on their behalf, that his ill-gotten wealth or that his misadventures in places like Ukraine are cost-free. All of those things we can essentially put on the table. Our challenge is that we can't lie, right? So we can do influence campaigns, but it has to be based on the truth. So we need to think our way through what do we hold at risk that Vladimir himself would care about. The rest of that's probably just a form of deprivation that the Russian society is quite used to.
Thanks.
Colonel, did you want to say anything? Colonel, did you want to say anything with respect to Russia since you live next door?
Yes, now it goes a little bit in a political field, especially for a military officer. The neighbors, you have to know your neighbors. And we have the kind of advantage, the little bit of history, and then we have to use that knowledge as much as possible, and we have to share it. We have to share it with our partners and then with wider international community.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm Joel Renner from the Center of International Studies at MIT. Chris, you mentioned earlier coordination, and that was in conjunction with
what was the term?
Coordination.
Coordination.
And the importance of governmental coordination. And you've, in a way, come back to it now, referring to all the tools of national power. When the Russians did what they did in Ukraine, no particular thing they did was new, but the world was astounded, and we were too, by the speed with which they did it and the way they coordinated it. Would you come back, you or others on the panel, I mean, the Russians were running around the track while the United States and NATO were tying our shoes. What steps need to be taken to make the United States better and NATO better at being able to coordinate the various tools of national power? We've said very little about that today, and it's one of the things we're frankly not very good at, and I wonder if you'd take a crack at that.
So I think coordination can be achieved any number of ways. If you're omniscient, you can write out the script and say, look, this is the time sequence of who's going to do what, when, and maybe some of those things happen concurrently. We don't live in that world. That's impossible. And so the kind of coordination that I think we need is a coordination that says we all understand what the strategic objectives are. Perhaps it's some declaration of what the norms are, and so that's the world we're trying to bring about. We all understand what then the various distinguished instruments of power are, and I don't mean just instruments of national power. Citizens have power, sectors have power, right? Various kind of institutions that are not governmental have power. So let's understand what all those are and what meaningful contribution, distinguished contributions they might make. And then we need muscle memory, right? Against those strategic objectives, using these instruments of power, we need to actually work through some things where we operationalize that, using Chris Kretz's earlier term. We just operationalize the prosecution of all those instruments of power to bring about the world, the kind of the stability and the kind of the execution of that plan to achieve norms, such that we then know what's happening 15 meters to the right of me or 10 miles to the left of me, not because it's on the script and not because somebody told me explicitly what they were going to do. I just know. I just know what the nature of that complementary interaction is. We lack the muscle memory. We lack the strategic objectives. We therefore are kind of, reduced to following scripts, which oftentimes are only defined within our narrow stovepipes.
And I would just add, I think the actions that we've taken over the last year or so are to drive a better collaboration so that we can make decisions at the speed of relevance, that we can then measure in a transparent way, in a risk-informed way, the decision calculus, and then be able to align cyber effects operations, whether defensive, offensive, or all the above, alongside the other instruments of power, not just government, power, as Chris is highlighting. And I think that's been absent from our decision calculus in the past because of the length it takes us to get to a decision. That's been the structural adjustments we've tried to make so that it now that is an option and can be made in a period of relevance or with speed.
Colonel Renner?
Yeah, would just add a very quick one from a NATO perspective. Decision-making is difficult. This is even in the nation sometimes difficult. And you can imagine what's the challenge at 29. But there's one point already what I would like to mention in addition or stress on that. This is messaging. We call it STRATCOM, strategic communication, or you could call it deterrence messaging. This is one of the important points. Of course, you have to have the means and capabilities, but the messaging is a very important step, what we discovered from a NATO perspective. And for example, a couple of days ago, stations of SEAD missiles in Romania, this was strong messaging by the US UCOM, okay, we just in combinations occur, but this was really one of the points to make the point. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Patrick Barry. I'm with General Dynamics, and I'm also a fellow at the New America Foundation in their cybersecurity program, formerly at DHS and OSD, where I worked with at least a few of you. My question relates to this issue of I think, Mr. Inglis, you put it, the muscle memory question, and where that occurs and how it occurs, and how can we get out of this trap of what I think all too often happens in this discipline, where we all know that we need to come together. In fact, virtually everyone acknowledged the importance of the different instruments and the whole of government approach. But where does that happen, and how does that happen, and how does it happen below the level of kind of the most senior decision makers in government, so that we can routinize it and operationalize it and build out, concepts for operating that account for all the complexities of this environment, right? And I'm struck by the fact that when I was at the Department of Homeland Security, without going into the classified specifics, it was far more easy to impose conditions on airlines that were traveling to the U.S. in the case of a terrorist threat than it was for people to come together and organize around whether to do a defensive or offensive cyberspace operation, again, without going into specifics. So how can we get that level of interplay between our different agencies at the lowest possible level and beyond the occasional direction from the most senior people to say, oh, go forth and collaborate and exchange
Yeah, so it's a great question. I don't know the address of the place where that happens today, because I'm not sure that it's happening frequently and richly enough, but I was greatly heartened. I was really pleased when Chris Krebs said, sharing information is one thing, but operational collaboration, that's another thing. I think that's what he was talking about. When he said, I'm sending somebody, or I sent somebody to the UK's National Cybersecurity Center, I was like, that's it. Because the degree of collaboration and muscle memory that's going to be built there, when they share things that they share without preconditions, such that one party surprises another, that will then kind of create the kind of growing sense of, oh, you've asked me the wrong question, or perhaps I'm offering you the wrong service, and all of a sudden you get to this much richer collaboration. Now that's government to government. Take the UK's National Cybersecurity Center, though, as a case in point where they've done that private sector to government. They've taken their version of NSA, GCHQ, and they've taken 650 people. That's a lot of people for them. And they put them on a floor plate where natural light streams in from all sides. It's an unclassified space. And they, side by side, with about 100, 150, I think I've got the numbers about right, members of the private sector, they seek, discover, and mitigate threats all day, side by side. Right? And that creates a muscle memory that creates collaboration at the foundational level, the lowest possible level, where the real work takes place, that gets stronger as you go up that stovepipe as opposed to gets weaker. That's the kind of muscle memory that we need. We need to do that. Maybe it's for the 57 critical threads that Chris talked about. Put teams against that. Once you achieve that professional intimacy close in, that muscle memory close in, you can sustain that at a distance. It's impossible to develop at a distance. You have to first develop it using the true professional intimacy, where the surprises occur, the synapses fire in ways you couldn't have imagined, then sustain that using all the virtual techniques that money can buy.
And I would just add that when that collaboration occurs, we strengthen the workforce at large, because the perspectives, the skill sets, et cetera, that are shared amplifies each of those organizations even greater. Not just the mission, but our workforce at large, inside and outside the government.
And I just would add, I mean, we did it in the counterterrorism fight.
Right.
Okay, so I mean, is that an anomaly, or is, I mean, but it can be done. It is very challenging, but I mean, we demonstrated that it can be done.
Just to add one thing, I mean, when we heard Krebs talking, I mean, he pointed out, and I think it's well to remember, DHS is a really new organization, and it started off really as a counter-terror organization. You were there, so you know what I'm talking about. So it's not so surprising that we're still digging the channels, you know, the way to work easily. And I think the DoD-DHS MOU, for example, and some other kinds of things have actually made a significant difference. Same in NATO. 3, 4, 5 years ago, NATO and the European Union basically didn't work together. Now, I wouldn't say it's perfect, but I would say it's significantly better than it has been. So I just think it's one of these things of real-life organizations and people learning how to work together at a relatively new problem. Right.
I'll just share with you what I learned kind of midway through my kind of education and leadership, far too late to actually make a difference. Somebody asked me one day, what's your definition of empowerment, Mr. Inglis, with all due respect? And I said something kind of stupid, like, I allow you to solve problems that I pick. And this loud buzzer goes off somewhere in the universe, and kind of guy said, that's just stupid, right? You don't know what the problems are, right? And so true empowerment is we describe what the strategic outcomes are, and then we put people who actually have the granularity of understanding what those challenges are and perhaps access to the mechanisms, put them side by side, cheek by jowl, and say, figure out how to solve those problems. And they will shock, stun, and amaze you with the innovation and the agility that they bring to bear. And that creates the kind of muscle memory that then grows from the bottom up. I think you need to do that. So.
Thank you.
I think we are about at the end. And I thank the panel very, very much. Thank the audience for the questions. I think we have one more panel focusing on securing the software supply chain, which will be here in a minute. But I do think we really have walked our way through, and I think we have to thank Catherine Lotrianti again for organizing this. If you think where we started with the... So let me thank the panel very much, and thank you.
Thank you.